Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fresh, your host. I'll be with you for the next hour. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com. My pleasure to be with you again this morning, and thank you for taking time to listen in. A special good morning to my friends in Hanford, California, Calgary, Alberta, Canada, Jamestown, North Dakota, Houston, Texas, Big Rapids, Michigan, Hollywood, Florida, and stations around the world. Thanks for listening in this morning. We're continuing our reading and discussion of the book, The Vatican Billions by Avro, Manhattan. Yesterday, by the end of the broadcast, we were talking about how the Church of Mammon, the Church of Idolatry, the Church of Antichrist, the Roman Catholic Church, was even bilking money from its parishioners in the confessional box. Of all the other things that we talked about, it came right down to the confessional box. The Roman Catholics greed for money. In an attempt to gain revenue, the Roman Catholic priest decided that in order to get a penance removed, he might make a contribution to the church. That's right. A penitent Roman Catholic go to the confessional box, confess his sins to the priest. The priest would issue a penance, and then to get the penance removed, the priest would take a donation. This is rank extortion. It became the secular powers became aware of it, and it was just too much. And there were actions taken by the secular power against the state, which obviously didn't work, because the secular power has no power over the Roman Catholic Church and its priesthood. And because of these extortions, the resentment grew. It says the result was not only growing resentment, but also avoidance of payment. And if you're following along, this is the last full paragraph on page 64, just backing up one paragraph from where we were yesterday. The result was not only growing resentment, but also avoidance of payment. Many, so as not to pay the oblations, began to stay away from Mass. The clergy retorted by making it punishable for them to do so. Indeed, they fined their own parishioners. They fined them if the latter frequented churches in other parishes. In order to escape these extortions, many of Roman Catholics would simply go to another church to avoid paying these extortions. And it says fines were enforced on those who omitted confession or communion at Christmas and Easter, for instance, upon those who neglected church fasts. And it says the higher clergy also imposed fines both upon lay folk and the lower clergy for every act of immorality, a system which became the cause of frequent extortion by unscrupulous high prelates, the immorality of clergymen having thus been turned into a regular and constant source of revenue for those above. The most efficient and steady method of extracting money, as well as the most widespread, was certainly that of tithes, which were a direct and indirect tax on the faithful. The latter had to give to the church 1/10 of all they produced. This applied not only to cottagers and farmers, but equally to merchants, shopkeepers, and even the poorest artisans. The laws, both ecclesiastical and temporal, this system of extortion was woven into the fabric of society. It was upheld by both the ecclesiastical or the church authorities and also the temporal authorities. Your local law enforcement officer enforced these ecclesiastical laws. That's why we have the separation of church and state in this country, being eroded leaps and bounds. It says the laws, both ecclesiastical and temporal, that is church-state, which of course had been interlinked with such a manner as to make the custom compulsory. That's what happens when you link the church and the state together. It becomes compulsory. Compliance becomes compulsory. Were considered to include even the down of a wife's geese, pot herbs in the gardens of laborers, and grass cut by the roadside. So you had to pay taxes on everything. And the secular power was there to assess what you owed to the church. And it says farmers were compelled to cart their tithing sheaves to the very houses of the priests. They had to bring also the milk which they owed, not as milk, but in the form of cheese, since cheese was more durable. This last injunction so incensed many farmers that they resorted to some most unchristian-like habits to spite both the ecclesiastic recipients and the church. Since the priests said that all their offerings were to God, they took such words literally, so that, wrote the English Bishop Quibble, at the end of the 13th century, many farmers in the Exeter diocese, instead of following the ancient and approved custom in our diocese, namely that men should bring their tithes of milk in the form of cheese, some maliciously bring their milk to church in its natural state, and adds the good bishop with genuine horror, what is even more iniquitous, finding none there to receive it, pour it out before the altar in scorn to God and his church, unquote. So that's how they protested this exorbitant form of extortion, that they taxed even the milk. And they would only receive that tax if the milk had been transformed into the form of cheese, which was more durable. So the farmer had to take his milk tithe and make cheese out of it and then deliver it to the priest. And out of revolt, they simply just took their milk in its raw form and dumped it before the altar in the church. There's your milk. There's your tithe. Sweep it up off the floor. That's how the Roman Catholics are treated when their church has unlimited sway, unlimited control. You see, Roman Catholics don't like their priests or their prelates or their popes any better than Protestants do. They're abused just like the rest of us. That's why I say, when the reality of what is being written about in this book is finally comprehended by Roman Catholics, they will see the error of their church, and they will repent of their Catholicism and unite with Christ, the merciful. Now, the spirit which prompted the Exeter farmers to act thus was, of course, widespread, particularly in times of scarcity, so that it was common for farmers, laborers, and others to think of all kinds of subterfuges to avoid paying. Many of these subterfuges, complained another hierarch, Archbishop Stratford, addressing the Synod of London in 1342, quote, were of excessive malice to the manifest prejudice of ecclesiastical rights, unquote. In other words, Roman Catholics just took it upon themselves to just trample all over the rights of the priests. That's rebellion in the Roman Catholic Church. And it says, in addition to giving tithes while they were still alive, the faithful had to give more while they were dying, and after they were dead even. Thus, a man who had his will written was bound to give tithes in his legacy, and it says, quote, a legatee, in other words, one who was preparing his will, is bound to give tithes in his legacy, even though it have been already tithed by the testator, unquote. As a 14th century manual for parish priests, the pupili oculi asserted, and since it was realized by the church that even the most devout of her members might fail at times to give her her dues, she made of such an omission nothing less than a mortal sin. After which the clergy invented a yet more profitable device, that of the mortuary. The mortuary. It says the mortuary fell with the weight of a millstone upon the estate of every dead Roman Catholic. The claim consisted of taking over the second best animal from the stock of anyone who had died possessed of not less than 3 animals, a claim which was not only regulated but also legalized. It was imposed by Archbishop Winchelsea, about the year 1305, and confirmed by Lingham in 1367. As a result, the mortuary became a kind of tax, amounting to succession duty. That is, a succession tax, or an inheritance tax of 33% on the personal property of the defunct Roman Catholic. It was soon turned into a set custom, acknowledged by both spiritual and temporal authorities. Rome has a difficult time collecting her taxes unless she has the help of the secular power, who enforce these ecclesiastical laws upon the people. It says it was soon turned into a set custom acknowledged by both spiritual and temporal authorities in practically every country of Christendom. In this manner, the Roman Catholic Church began to appropriate 1/3 of a dead man's personal estate. Many people, like the executor farmers, tried to avoid payment. A typical case is that found among the many pleas to the English Parliament in the year 1330. One Thomas Leforter had paid what he claimed to be a just mortuary on the estate of William Leforter. William. And it says this in his capacity as executor. So we have an executor of an estate paying the mortuary. And it says the deceased parson, however, the abbot of Wenlock, sued him in the episcopal court, claiming a full 1/3 of the deceased property, saying that this was the usual mortuary. Thomas appealed to the king, who decreed that, quote, exactions of this kind manifestly redound to the oppression of the realm, unquote. So here we have a secular king standing up and saying enough is enough. Okay? This is rebellion. And it says he therefore forbade the bishop to side with the abbot. It says Parliament intervened and set up a kind of commission, presided over by 3 abbots. These, invoking a statute of Edward I to the effect that no prohibition could avail to stop proceedings in the episcopal court on a question of tithes or mortuary, compelled the heir to pay in full. So that's the church's response. They set up a tribunal of prelates, and they restored the Pope's privilege. That is, to assess a deceased Roman Catholic 1/3 of all his estate. So there you have the spiritual power arising above that of the secular power. That's how Rome reacts. The Roman Catholic Church is the spiritual authority, and in her teaching, the spiritual authority always powers the secular power. The secular power is there as an auxiliary of the church, and it may not defeat the Pope's liberties and rights. And it must submit to the papal authority, and it must serve the papacy. Now, it continues, it says, the rapacity of the church and her clergy reached unprecedented lengths. Suffice it to state that following Thomas Aquinas, the Doctor Angelicus, they call him in the Roman Catholic Church, theologians came to the learned conclusion that the Roman Catholic Church had the right to collect tithes even from lepers and beggars, who were under an obligation to pay 1/10 of their collections. That's right. You incapacitated some way, medically, physically, mentally, you go out in the street and hold up your cup and looking for the charitable contributions of those who are compassionate for your state of affairs. The Roman Catholic Church claimed 1/10 of that gift. And it says, what about prostitutes? It says, following a modest hesitation and few clerical blushes, the Battalion of Theological Bachelors decided that Holy Mother Church must refuse the prostitute's contributions to her chaste coffers. But, they added, and here's the theological gem, so long as they were unrepentant, lest she, the Church, would give the impression that she shared in their sins. Look, the Roman Catholic Church keeps the prostitutes in business. The Roman Catholic priests, the celibate priests, look to prostitutes for relief. And that's why they're so timid and tiptoe around the prostitutes, because the prostitutes know who their customers are. Yes, but we can't have the Roman Catholic Church being viewed as sharing in the sins of the prostitutes, when the prostitute's main income is the Roman Catholic priest. You talk about hypocrisy. That it is the church of hypocrisy. Now, it says, no wonder in the book of Revelation it calls the Roman Catholic Church the whore that rides the sinful bloody beast. It says, should, however, the prostitutes repent of their sins, or should their sins remain secret to the average burg or burgher, although the church knew about them, then yes, the tithes may be taken, it said. In addition to the oblations, tithes, and mortuaries, there were other means by which to replenish the church's treasures with individual sizable amounts from the heretics. Now they're going to tithe the heretics. It says the Inquisition was very precise about it. Listen to Diana. In his 43rd resolutio, he put the question, quote, are the possessions of heretics turned over to the inquisitors? Unquote. Quoting further, it says, I speak not, answers Diana, for other countries, but the Spanish custom is to confiscate to the royal treasury all the possessions of heretics, because our king, who is a pillar of orthodoxy, in other words, a devout Roman Catholic, generously supplies the inquisitors and their agents with whatever the Holy Office requires, unquote. Thanks to this principle, the church could obtain vast estates or substantial wealth when prosperous individuals were, as often happened, accused of heresy and condemned, sometimes in collusion with the temporal authorities. That's right. The Roman Catholic Church worked in collusion with the secular power to steal the property of heretics. And it says, witness, for instance, the case of Philip II, and the date is given 1556 to 1598. It says 2/3 of the income of the Inquisition went to him, the rest to the Roman Catholic institution. So it's a no-win situation. The state and the church both cooperate with one another for the financial benefit. There's no incentive not to take the property of a heretic, either from the church or from the secular power. And it says further, to the Inquisition were the weapons of interdiction and excommunication. These were used with increasing frequency to compel, to force the faithful to pay under practically any pretext. Thus, for example, church and temporal powers would often use excommunication for their mutual benefit, as they used the Inquisition. Witness Regent Blanche of Castile, who in 1228 issued an edict addressed to the authorities of Nimes and Narbonne, directing that the excommunicated, who remained unreconciled for a whole year, should be forced to seek absolution by the seizure of their property. To quicken the process, a fine of 10 livres was exacted on all those excommunicated who had not entered the church within 40 days. To make money, the clergy, as already mentioned, forced the faithful to purchase escapes from excommunication. In other words, if the church threatened excommunication, you could buy your way out. I'm telling you, it's a racket, and it still goes on today. It says their threats often related to the most trivial matters. For instance, at vintage time, when the reapers are rather ready to go out and gather up the grapes, the tithers, that is the priests, forbade them, under pain of excommunication, the gathering of their grapes until they, the priests, could choose the best, so that very often the peasants, owing to frequent delays, saw the ruin of their crops. In other words, the church had to come in and get their tenth out of the best of the crop. They had to visually inspect the vineyards. And many times they were so late with their inspections and their assessment of their tithes from the viners that the crop literally wasted on the vine. It says some popes, besides thundering on behalf of the church as a whole, did so in their own personal interest. Pope John VIII, for example, who reigned from 872 to 882, left on record at least 382 epistles, no less than 150 of which referred to excommunication. And it is interesting to relate almost all dealt with temporal possessions of the church, some with worthwhile substantial solid affairs like the transfer or promise of a whole kingdom, but some with the most ridiculous and petty concerns. To mention one, the excommunication hurled by good Pope John against those miscreants who stole what? Nothing other than the papal horse upon which the Pope was traveling through France. They stole his horse. It says, or that other papal bolt of lightning that was issued against those quote-unquote knaves who had pilfered his plate while he was staying at the Abbey of Avigny. Somebody stole his food. And it says, and said the Pope, to add insult to injury, quote, probably with the connivance of the Abbey's monks, unquote. And remember, it was the monks who stripped themselves of all earthly goods in protest of the Roman Catholic Church's covetousness and immense wealth. They denounced their own church by their own behavior, and yet these monks eventually were turned over to revenue-generating operations for the Roman Catholic Church. It says, but one of the grossest abuses of excommunication was that perpetrated by bishops and even by hierarchs who began to excommunicate the neighbors of the originally excommunicated person. The result being that when finally the family of the latter was exiled and his whole property confiscated by the church, the Roman Catholic Church, dozens of others, his neighbors, were placed under the same ban and hence the same penalties. That is, their properties could be, and as a rule were, confiscated. The excommunications employed by popes down to the lowest priests for motives of the basest avarice become so frequent and scandalous that many individuals and temporal authorities, including numerous genuinely devout persons of the Roman Catholic Church, complain bitterly about them. Owing to such abuses, multitudes were driven to desperation, as the Diet of Nuremberg stated in 1522. The immense wealth thus collected finally reached such proportions that the Roman Catholic Church economic stranglehold upon all and sundry was no less massive than her spiritual dominion, and almost paralyzed whole countries. During the reign of Francis I from 1515 to 1547, for instance, a mere 600 abbots, bishops, and archbishops controlled so much land throughout France that the income they derived from it equaled that of the French state itself. You see, Rome never gives anything away. She only takes and takes and takes and takes and takes. The Roman Catholic Church is the biggest leech upon mankind in the history of this world. And their accumulation of wealth continues and continues and continues until it literally owns controlling interest of every nation on the planet, including the United States of America. Are you tired of paying taxes? Are you tired of having your 401c, your 501, your 401ks robbed, your pensions, your retirement benefits, your Social Security robbed by the federal government? Do you suspect that possibly the drain, the giant sucking sound of the wealth of this country leaving this nation might be attributed to the same one that it's always been attributed to? You better find out how the Roman Catholic Church controls your government and what laws are in place to support the Roman Catholic Church with your tithe money, with your retirement benefits, with your Social Security benefits, with your income tax payments. You know, there was a time in Great Britain when the Roman Catholic Church controlled 1/3 of the tillable soil in Great Britain. Great Britain couldn't survive financially. And that was about the time of the Protestant Reformation. And that's when the Protestants separated Great Britain from the papacy and nationalized all Roman Catholic Church property and put it back into the productive use of the citizens of that nation. That's what needs to happen in this country and every country around the world. It says France was not an exception. Practically every other country in Western Europe was in the same situation. The economic dominion of Holy Mother Church had become a collective stranglehold that was slowly but inexorably paralyzing the most vital structures of the land tenancies, commerce, and finance of Christendom. She had become such a dead weight that the revolt which her practices provoked, after simmering below the surface for hundreds of years, in due course exploded with the violence of an earthquake. It came disguised in theological garb when the hammer of a rebel monk, I'll name him Martin Luther, nailing some theses upon the church door at Wittenberg, made Rome totter on her foundations for decades, indeed for centuries to come. That's the end of the chapter, but I'll tell you, Rome is fast reviving and soon will control the world in the New World Order. Martin Luther's been long forgotten. His 95 Theses have been long forgotten. The world is repeating the ignorance that allowed the papacy to rise to world control back during the day of her heyday during the Middle Ages, and we're returning to those days. Now, Chapter 8 is entitled Holy Mass Tourism for each generation. Chapter 8. It says, it all happened in the year 1300 of the incarnation of our Lord, when the blessed Peter's vicar on earth, Pope Boniface VIII proclaimed that from the previous Christmas to the next, and on every 100th year following, Roman Catholics visiting the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome would have the fullest pardon for all their sins. What believer could resist such unheard of and immense spiritual bounty? And so it was that Burger McCracken from Scotland, Manfred Domino from Sicily, Count Stanislav from Poland, the Knight von Arnim from Saxony, Signor Alvaro from Spain, Ola Olafsson from Scandinavia, Signor Merigo Bernini from Florence, Charles Montfroid from Paris, and thousands of others suddenly departed, all in the same direction and toward the same goal: Rome, the holy city. You know, that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. And it says, what had prompted Pope Boniface to create such a precedent so unexpectedly? What arcane revelation had induced him to fling wide open the gates to the treasures of heaven? The answer is but one: the allure of the treasures of earth. For truly devoted to the blessed Peter, which in the early golden days had made the naive Saxons flock to his tomb in Rome to ask his pardon, had greatly diminished. Coin offerings had dwindled to next to nothing. The sad fact was that whereas the local hierarchs in many parts of Christendom were becoming fat and rich, the Holy Father in the heart of Rome was becoming increasingly poor. St. Peter's coffers, he was being repeatedly told by his treasurers, were very low. Indeed, they were well nigh empty. Something had to be done to replenish them. And thus it came to pass that one day Providence provided Pope Boniface with a truly providential inspiration. This he had after a man reputed to have reached the ripe old age of 107 years had kissed his feet, saying that in the year 1200 his father had come to Rome to offer a coin to St. Peter in order to receive an indulgence for the remission of sins. Hearing this, Boniface needed no further providential prompting. He thanked God that he had been told about it just at the beginning of the year 1300. Better late than never, of course. Being a man of action, he speedily proclaimed the Jubilee on the 22nd of February 1300 to the amazement, surprise, and delight of many, particularly in Rome. The good children of the Roman Catholic Church, most of whom did not believe that they could emulate the vigorous old man of 107 years, but realizing that so wholesome a remission of sins was truly the chance of a lifetime, did not hesitate. They left their villages, cities, and countries by the thousands. Europe saw a mass movement, the likes of which had never before been seen or experienced, and all compressed within a single calendar year. A contemporary, Villani, declared that there were at least 200,000 pilgrims daily in Rome. G. Ventura, another contemporary of the time, an eyewitness, said that crowds were so great that he saw men and women trampled underfoot. The poet Dante could find no better comparison for the multitudes of the damned in his Inferno than the crowds which congregated in Rome during this Jubilee. But if the pilgrims went to Rome to gain the total remission of their sins, they had to show their gratitude to the blessed Peter and Paul, not only with prayers, but also with a more tangible token of their reverence, that is, with money. And this they did. Cardinal Gaetano, nephew of the Pope, admitted that his uncle Boniface received more than 30,000 gold florins offered by pilgrims at the altar of St. Peter alone, and over 20,000 at that of St. Paul. He was in a position to know. In addition, we have the description of an eyewitness who took part in the same Jubilee pilgrimage, the historian Ventura. Ventura has assured us that the tribute received by Pope Boniface on this occasion was incomputable. Then, to prove that his estimate was not exaggerated, he gives a glorious description. At the altar of St. Paul, he says, where he went to pray himself, there stood by day and by night 2 clerks, quote, raking in infinite money, unquote. Those are his very words. Pope Boniface's Jubilee had proved a tremendous success. The Blessed Peter's coffers were replenished, and Rome prospered once more for a while. Boniface's successors, however, brooded. Some of them could never hope to see the beginning of the next century, since the lives of the popes in those days were very often shortened, not only by age, but also by daggers, poison, and greedy nephews. And so one bright day in January of the year 1343, Pope Clement VI issued a bull declaring that in view of the shortness of human life, he had reduced the Jubilee's span from 100 to 50 years. Then, to make sure that the pilgrims would come in multitudes, as on the first occasion, he offered them a further spiritual inducement. In June of 1346, he issued another bull in which he asserted that he had complete control and indeed power over the future life. And proceeding to exact details, he told the prospective pilgrims that he could order the angels of heaven to liberate from purgatory the souls of any of them who might die on the road to Rome. Now, are you starting to see that third and final crown around the brim of the papal tiara taking shape and form? That's the Pope's power over, in this case, purgatory, but hell. He's still raising his throne above that of God, proclaiming himself to be God, having power over heaven and the earth and the underworld. And it says, Pope Clement's additional spiritual inducements proved a tremendous success, for it must be remembered that traveling in those days was the most hazardous occupation anyone could undertake. Traveling was mainly on foot. Horse riding was only for the few. There were no hotels, hardly any real roads, no food provisions. In other words, there wasn't a Mickey D's every 20 miles. And there weren't any banks or police on the way, but on the contrary, robbers all along the way, starvation, sleeping in the open, and disease. About the time of this second Jubilee, there was also appeared the Black Death, which truly decimated the population of Europe. To realize how hazardous an enterprise it was, suffice it to remember that during the first and second Jubilees, only 1 out of 10 pilgrims returned home alive. So if you're going to Rome to get your sins forgiven, to have the treasures of heaven opened and bestowed upon you by the biblical Antichrist, the Pope of Rome, you have a 1 chance in 10 of making it home alive. Sound like a good deal to you? It says, yet, in spite of all this, during the Easter of the Jubilee, it was estimated that there were more than 1 million pilgrims in Rome. Many people were trampled to death at the tombs of the apostles. Once again, the concrete gratitude of the pilgrims replenished St. Peter's coffers beyond Clement's wildest dreams. Many others throughout Christendom, however, could not or would not come. Either the Black Death had killed their families or had ruined them, or their survivors had to attend to important business or were too feeble to undertake such a risky journey. But their piety and their longing for remission of sins, with the added privilege of liberating a soul from the flames of purgatory, were no less sincere than were these feelings in the in the fortunate ones who had gone to Rome in person. The Pope listened, agreed, and in his paternal consideration for the spiritual welfare of those far-away children, he decreed that they too should partake of the privileges of the indulgences of the Jubilee. He began with Hugh, King of Cyprus, Edward III and Henry, Duke of Lancaster in England, Queen Isabella of France, Queen Philippa of England, and Queen Elizabeth of Hungary. These all responded with regal oblations, that is, with generous, solid payments of gold. But if kings and queens had not been thus favored, why not lesser folks, as good Roman Catholics as their majesties? The Pope agreed and promptly instructed his representatives outside Rome to exempt the would-be pilgrims from undertaking the dangerous journey, provided, of course, that they did not forget to show their gratitude to the Blessed Peter with a little offering. The papal nuncio in Sicily was one of the first to carry out the instructions. He exempted 30 persons from undertaking the pilgrimage, provided they pay what the pilgrimage would have cost them had they actually gone to Rome. And so the practice of collecting from penitents at home sums equivalent to the cost of the pilgrimage was born. The advantages for both sides were too obvious to miss, and so hierarchs in other countries decided to imitate the Pope. In 1420, the Archbishop of Canterbury proclaimed a jubilee with the same quote-unquote pardons as those of Rome. This precedent, however, was too dangerous. Supposing it spread to other countries, Martin V, the reigning pope, called it, quote, audacious sacrilege, unquote, threatened excommunication, and the enterprising archbishop had to be content with local revenues. The Jubilee of 1450 was again an immense success. The amount of gold collected from the pilgrims was so huge that Pope Nicholas V struck a coin known as the Jubilee. This coin was of such unusual size that it equaled 3 of the ordinary gold pieces used at that time by the royal mints of Europe. One of Pope Nicholas's successors, Pope Paul II, in 1470, reduced the interval of the Jubilee to 25 years. Remember, it went from 100, then to 50, and now 25 years. We're trying to get as many of these Jubilees within the normal lifespan of a pope as we can possibly muster. And to prompt the pilgrims to come to Rome instead of benefiting from the Jubilee privileges at home, he suspended all other indulgences. He's going to force them to come to Rome now. And it says, notwithstanding such measures, however, the Jubilee of 1475 was not a great success. Nevertheless, even on this occasion, the Roman Catholic Church as a whole benefited insofar as the payment of specific sums continued increasing. The sums thus paid, of course, varied according to the status, wealth, and dignity of the quote-unquote exempted pilgrims. From archbishops, bishops, and nobles down to counts, 4 gold florins had to be paid. Abbots and barons paid 3 gold florins, lesser nobles, doctors, notaries, 2 florins, all others 1 gold florin. During the Jubilee of 1500, Pope Alexander VI, whose love of money was notorious, decided to add something new and initiated the first ceremony on the opening of the Holy Door. The opening of the Holy Door. What the Holy Door should have been, or was never clearly understood, except that it was a device to entice the pilgrims to Rome. However, Pope and architect looked in vain for such a holy door at St. Peter's Basilica. The door could not be found, so one was prepared in haste, so as not to disappoint the oncoming penitents. To make even more money, Pope Alexander VI charged his representatives, most of whom were called penitentiaries, with authority to reduce the days being spent on the pilgrimages on payment of 1/4 of the expense thus saved. In addition to this, they were also authorized to compound for irregularity, for instance, on a charge of simony on payment of 1/3 of the sums acquired by it. In this manner, the Basilica of St. Peter was soon transformed into a veritable marketplace where pardons, indulgences, merits, dispensations, and such like religious privileges were sold, exchanged, resold, and marketed over the papal money chests. This is what we call simony, folks. It originates with the very first pope, Simon Magus, the Simonian, who offered money to St. Peter for ecclesiastical favors. It still characterizes his church, the Roman Catholic Church. It is the church of simony. True to its inheritor, it is the church of simony. And it says, not content with that, Alexander in 1501 began to collect additional money throughout the rest of Europe by dispatching his legates everywhere, selling the indulgences at a discount. That is, for 1/5 of what a pilgrimage to Rome would have cost the potential pilgrim buyers. More than one Catholic king, no less business-minded and no less in need of money than the Pope, considered the idea an excellent one, to mention the most notorious of them, Henry VIII of England, who came to a cordial understanding with the papal legate as to the royal share of the proceeding. This was the last Jubilee before the Protestant Reformation. Indeed, it was the Jubilee which, unnoticed almost by all, had planted the seeds which would eventually blossom into the portentous trees that were ultimately to make the monolithic structure of the papacy cracked into two mighty halves and bring about the emergence of Protestantism. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. It led to the Protestant Reformation. This love of money. And isn't it a shame that even Protestants have resorted to many of these same tactics? We must repent. Christ is coming soon, and so is Inquisition Update tomorrow. Thanks for listening.